All right, hello, welcome everyone. My name is Leandra. I'm the Communications and Resource Development Director for Montana Nonprofit Association. Thanks so much for joining us today. I'm really excited about this webinar, Breaking Through the Echo Chamber Media Outreach for Nonprofits. It's presented by Josh Wise from the Public News Service. Public News Service is a member of MNA and they're a valued partner, and Josh has a ton of experience, so you are in very good hands today. Without further ado, Josh, please take it away.
All right, there we go. Now I'm unmuted. Thank you, Leandra, and thank you to MNA for allowing us to do the webinar. Again, my name is Josh Wise. I'm the Director of Outreach and Partnerships at Public News Service, and I'm now going to share my screen so I can pull up the ever-present PowerPoint presentation that goes along with these webinars. And there we go. So the reason that we decided to offer this training is, you know, I've spent my career before coming to Public News Service working in nonprofit advocacy, and I know for a lot of folks, often it feels like you're talking to the same people over and over, you know, or talking into an echo chamber, however you want to think about it, preaching to the choir. And so, you know, but that doesn't mean that the work that you're doing is not important to the people who are outside of that audience. Often it's the people who are outside of that audience that your work is most important to, whether it's affected communities, or policymakers, or, you know, just a wide variety of people who are hard to reach. And so hopefully through this webinar, you'll at least get some ideas for how some creative ways or some ways that you can just incorporate into how you're telling your stories that will help you break through to those audiences. I won't claim to have all the answers. Media is an ever-changing dynamic, but you know, this is drawing on the experience of myself and of Public News Service. Public News Service, what we are is the national newswire for public interest news. The way that we work is we have 37 news services around the country, and I forgot to update the one for Montana. I did this for New York last week. In Montana, it's called Big Sky Connection. I'll update that before I send the slides out after the webinar. But we distribute to about 30,000 outlets today around the country every day. We make all of our content free for media outlets to use. About 50 million people a week hear Public News Service content, mostly on local radio. And you know, in addition to kind of reaching that geographically diverse audience, we're also on a bunch of different formats. So we're reaching an audience that's fairly ideologically diverse and demographically diverse as well. We're supported by members around the country who fund a beat of reporting. And I'll have my contact info up after the, at the end of the webinar if anyone wants to learn more about that. But you know, one thing I'll say just right off the bat is that, so we are not typical, you know, or as you are, in that we're not a nonprofit pitching media. We are the media, but we are distributing to stations. And so we're reliant on a lot of these same techniques in order to get the attention of news directors so that they will take and air our content, which is all news stories. And I'll walk you through some of them later on. Just a little bit about me. I think as it says in my bio, I got my start when I was 6 doing nonprofit mailings in exchange for baseball card money, but I've been doing this for about 20 years professionally. I've been an ED, I've been a communications director, I've been a consultant, but I've also done a bunch of other stuff, right? When you're running small nonprofits, you do just about everything. So I've been a lobbyist and a community organizer and an accountant, and I can run a commercial boiler because that's just what you do when you run a small nonprofit. I've also taught fundraising and communications at the graduate level at Metropolitan State University in Minnesota, which is where I live. a little bit about you. Especially if you're on the smaller side, we're always wearing multiple hats in the nonprofit sector. A bunch of people, maybe you got thrown into communications just because somebody had to do it and you haven't had a ton of training. But if you're on the larger side, maybe you're a former journalist, but you're learning a totally new point of view, and how to communicate as someone who's doing advocacy work or, just other public awareness work. We're always trying to do more with less, clearly, and resources are always scarce, so we can't be wasting time on ineffective work. A little bit about journalists. They're always on a deadline. They're cynical because they're constantly having people come at them with their own spin on things. They're inundated with press releases and pitches. The industry is consolidating, especially outside of major metro areas. There are fewer and fewer outlets and fewer opportunities for people to be a professional journalist. So they're also always trying to do more with less. Again, especially outside of the major metro areas, many outlets no longer actually have their own editorial staff, and they're relying on syndicated content or content that they can really easily package into usable material. So whatever we can do to make their jobs easy is a win for both of us. This is how I talk about all communications. It doesn't matter if you're doing media pitching, fundraising, etc. There's always this three-legged stool of message, target, messenger. And so that's basically how we're going to go through this presentation today. I'm planning on, I like having a lot of questions and I don't mind being interrupted. So Shelby's monitoring the chat, and if you have a question, just go ahead and type it into the chat. I'm going to pause at the end of each of these sections to see, to try to answer any additional questions. But Shelby, if there's something really kind of pertinent to the slide that I'm on, feel free to jump in.
Will do.
Okay, so starting with the message, and of course you can't have a presentation on journalism without referencing Ron Burgundy. I jest. But often there are some things that we feel like we need to do as nonprofit communicators, and such as having your name in the news, having your executive director quoted, things like that aren't necessarily the things that media outlets are looking for when they're looking for what's making a good story. So if we're thinking about what makes something easy for journalists, what I like to do, and I like to do this with all communications, is start with your mission. What is it that you're trying to get accomplished? What you're doing is more important or more interesting than who you are. So it's important to lead with what it is you're actually trying to do. Does what's going on in the world that you can tie whatever it is your pitch is to? Often you're putting out statements or you're putting out press releases that are specifically in response to something that's happened, in current events, whether it's a legislative session, elections at this time of year, right? Voter education is obviously really important. But often if it's something like the launch of a new program, or, you're an arts organization and you're announcing your concert season, that type of stuff, it's sort of a standalone thing, but you want to think about what are the things that are going on in the rest of the world that this is relevant to, and how do we talk about that in the story that we're telling. For some of you, some of these things may be review, but just to go over, can you marry heart and mind? How do you tell a personal story that's backed up by data? Again, this is relevant to everything that we're communicating about in the nonprofit sector. How do you put a human face on the numbers that tell the story of what your organization is doing, or tell the story of the problem that your organization is trying to address? Lead with the lead. So you've figured out those three things. What's the most important thing that you're trying to convey? What is it you want people to get out of reading your press release or your pitch? That's your lead, and you want to make sure that it's stated up front. The biggest reason for that is that if I'm a journalist and I'm getting 100 press releases a day, I'm only going to read the first sentence of most of them. And so in that first sentence, I want to know, what is the hook here that's going to convince me to read the rest of the press release, and then potentially turn it into content that I'm going to publish. Do you have multiple sources? Who else is doing this work? This is something that often you don't have time to do, but if you do have time to do, if you can collaborate, if you're doing work in coalition, or if there are other voices that you can incorporate into the story, that always makes for something that's more interesting and a little more, again, easy for a journalist to use. And then just lastly, having been an executive director and been on both sides of this, I feel like I'm okay saying this, but your executive director is not your audience, right? For media, often, getting back to what I started with, they want to see the name in the news, they want to see the quote in the news. But that's not necessarily the most important thing for having a good story that's going to get heard by a lot of people or seen by a lot of people. So I have a couple of examples here, and I've got my tabs pulled up. So instead of this, and I'll just say, if you want a huge trove of nonprofit press releases, PR Newswire lets you just search everything that goes out. So if you're looking for, ideas about how to write press releases, I encourage you just to browse the site. But this particular press release is a studio has received their nonprofit certification and is now able to raise a bunch of money. And that's what they lead with, right? This is who they are, production company, and they now have a fiscal sponsorship. Well, good for them, but I have no idea why that's an important story. It's not till I get all the way down here where I learned that this is what it's for, is to make a documentary about PTSD and first responders. Well, that's a really important issue, and it's a really compelling story, but I don't know that until I read the last paragraph. And so if I'm seeing that coming over into my inbox, I got to read all the way down, and chances are I'm not going to do that. Instead, you can do this. Hold on a second. That was not the one I wanted to show you. This is from Goodwill Easter Seals. And, right up front, they're leading with their lead, right? Here's the problem. The number of adult Americans with disabilities is growing, and job losses for this group is outpacing the rest of unemployment. And Easter Seals is asking businesses to commit to diversity and inclusiveness in their workplaces. So problem, solution, here's what we're doing about it. It's concise, it's right up front. And, if you read through here, you really see how they're, they've got the personal story, they've got, their statistics. And so they're doing all the right things here. Hold on just a sec. I need the Zoom toolbar to go back up so I can get to the next tab. All right. So here's a recent story in Montana that Public News Service did about, satellite sites on Montana campuses helping students vote. We're leading with the lead here. Satellite offices on Montana college campuses are helping students to get to the polls. And then the rest of the story is here's why. We've got, the personal story right here. When we go to the community, we're trying to help it so that voters can get to services in their communities. I think there's some data down here. 2000 gubernatorial election was decided by 7,500 votes, which is less than half of the fall enrollment at Montana State. So now I want to talk a little bit about a concept called polarity management. And when we piloted this presentation in New York last week, one of the feedback I got from my colleague was that this is a really complex topic, and we're only able to scratch the surface in this particular webinar and get to everything else that I want to talk about. So maybe don't try to do everything related to polarity management, but we are going to kind of scratch the surface and introduce the concept here. We do a full day training on polarity management. So as a preface, let's talk about what it is. It's originally a management tool, but the basic premise is that there are always multiple perspectives to something. It doesn't matter what the issue is. There's nothing where 100% of public opinion is united. When we're journalists thinking about how are we creating news stories, we want to be thinking about, okay, so what are the different perspectives on this? How do we find different sources? How do we find multiple perspectives so that we can capture the truth of what the story is? And so that's something you want to be thinking about when you're writing your own pitches. Part of this is finding ways to connect to audiences who maybe are coming at things from different ideological frames, right? Our frames are created by ways, or are the ways in which we're relating to the world. Our own biases and what we're doing are shaped by our frames and our polarities. And in the nonprofit sector, we definitely we wouldn't be doing this work if we didn't feel very strongly about something, right? That's something, it doesn't matter whether you're right or wrong, or the data supports or doesn't support what it is that you're trying to do. You have a bias based towards what you're actually doing. Otherwise, you wouldn't be doing the work. And so part of what polarity management is about is figuring out how we acknowledge those biases in our storytelling so that we can then pivot back to continue telling our story in a much more compelling way. And this is a big part of how we can be creating communications that are breaking outside of that echo chamber, because we're allowing audiences who are coming from potentially different frames to be engaging with what we're saying. So one thing we do for every issue that we're reporting on at Public News Service is we make these charts. And it's not that we're trying to include all this in our story, but we want to be aware of what the different, the opposite poles for each of these issues are, right? So this is, just an example for environmental issues. And then it kind of goes into this is sort of the general polarity management graph. And again, we're just scratching the surface here. For each pole, there are positive feelings and there are negative feelings with it. And so you can put your, different poles, the negative and positive feelings onto each side of here with the different poles. And so you kind of have an idea of what are all of the different perspectives that we're trying to manage, either manage or discard when we're telling our story. So, that was this was about toy regulation. You can see what the poles are, but this is how we incorporated some of that into a story. And again, this will go out with the slides, so I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this. So instead of, only including one perspective, which is the toy safety, we need to make sure that our kids are not being poisoned perspective, very valid perspective. Not a lot of people would disagree with that. We want to acknowledge that there are costs to doing that as well, that it is, it's potentially a burden on small businesses in the state. So one of the ways we do that is by having a small business owner quoted here saying, nobody wants kids to have unsafe toys. Safety is our #1 priority. So we're going to do everything we can to comply with these new regulations. At the same time, we're trying to work with the state and other regulators to come up with a solution so that we can continue to make toys at an affordable price. So the idea is by incorporating multiple perspectives, you can engage the people who come at this from the opposite pole of safety and regulation, which is we need to make sure that we are supporting a vibrant economy too. And it's acknowledging that perspective, but then pivoting back to say, but overall safety is the #1 priority here. There's another example of a public news service story that we had done that acknowledges that. I won't go into it because I don't want to belabor this concept too much. But why do we do this? One, it allows you to connect with a more diverse audience, like I said. Presenting and defending against a counter perspective just makes for a stronger story, right? If you think about this in a literary sense, a good novel always has tension and release, right? There are periods where conflict is building and then conflict is resolving. And it's just, it's true in any form of art, really. I mean, music is the same way. So having some of that tension and release within your pitch or your press release makes for a compelling story, and it makes it something that a journalist is going to want to engage with, because one, it helps them see the big picture or the whole picture, but two, you've kind of done their job for them by having those multiple perspectives, so it's easier for them to run the content. The thing I want to leave with here is that this isn't both sidism, you know, and you know, you shouldn't feel obligated, or you definitely shouldn't have both sidism in whatever your pitch is. I call it the critical recognition of the other, meaning that we can acknowledge the perspective, engage with the perspective, and then come back to our perspective. All right. Shelby, are there any questions before I move on?
Not so far, but if you do have
Okay.
any.
All right. I will keep going. So now we've moved from message to target, right? This is our audience. This is who we want to reach. And you know, how we can think about that. When I'm thinking about, you know, who I want to reach with a media pitch, it again goes back to my mission, and really what is it I'm trying to do, right? Mission of my organization, what are the objectives of my organization? What is the objective of this particular thing that I'm writing a press release or a pitch about? You know, and you go through those three things, and that should tell you, you know, what the purpose of the communication actually is, right? These are all the reasons, you know, some of the reasons you could be, you know, sending out a press release. You're building awareness for a new program. So you want to maybe, you know, reach people in a new community. It's the middle of a legislative session and you're working to change a public policy or change funding priorities. You know, some of it is to raise money or expand programming. One thing I will say about fundraising communications, just right off the bat, is that if you're trying to do media to fundraise, but you're not doing all of the other fundamentals of fundraising, your media will be completely ineffective. So I won't spend too much time talking about why, but just I feel very strongly about that, having done a lot of fundraising. Are you trying to build a client base for your services? Are you trying to inform affected communities about an issue? I mean, reaching affected communities is really hard. You know, are you trying to sell tickets to an event? Are you trying to just drive people to an event? And now we talk about audiences, right? Who are the people, you know, for each of the things that you're trying to do, there is a distinct audience. You know, these are all of the, you know, different audiences that you could be potentially wanting to reach outside of the public writ large. And of course, you know, for everything that you're trying to do, you have to think about what your geographic area is. It may seem really really obvious, you know, but if you're sending out a national press release for a program that's happening in Montana, and I've seen that happen. Like you know, we'll get press releases often sent to us at Public News Service that are for places where we just don't have a news service. So, and if you're paying for a PR newswire or something, well, that's wasted money. But the real takeaway here is that we're not speaking to all of these audiences at all times. It doesn't matter if you're doing media or any other communication. There are audiences that you're not speaking to on purpose. And you have to be mindful of that. Otherwise, you kind of end up with something that's planned and not pointed, and not tailored to actually achieve the thing that you want to achieve. That's especially true if your, you know, executive director and board is always an audience that you're speaking to when you're doing media, right? They, you know, even though you want them to see it and be proud of the accomplishment of the organization getting media coverage, if you're thinking about the objectives of your organization, they're maybe not the audience sometimes. And then what I like to do is I like to make a map. I'm a big mind mapper. You can also do this in chart form if you like spreadsheets better, or table form. But I like to, you know, what I do is I connect the dots or connect the lines between the things that I'm trying to accomplish and the audiences that are affected by this. I didn't do the next step here, but we'll talk about it, which is for all of these audiences and issues, we want to connect them to different mediums for communicating. So this map can get kind of big. You know, what are we trying to say? Who are we trying to say it to? How are we trying to say it? It's basically message, target, messenger in visual form. All right. So I'm going to spend the rest of the webinar talking about the mediums, and I'm going to focus on radio. One, because that's what we do a lot of at Public News Service, is creating content for the radio, but the other is that it's a fairly untapped market for a lot of nonprofit organizations. But you may be familiar with the Marshall McLuhan idiom. The medium is the message, and the idea behind that is that the type of thing that someone is consuming as media really informs the type of the content or the substance of what it is that's being consumed, right? So if someone hears your content on the radio versus reads it versus sees it on TV, they're maybe going to take away different things. And so, when you're thinking about knowing your audience, one of the things that you want to do is know what type of medium they consume, and what the message is that they take away from that particular medium. If you're a small organization, often doing this amount of research is challenging, but I would encourage you, to say, well, we don't need to do this all at once. We can do this over time. And so we want to be consistently soliciting feedback from our different audiences so that we have some idea of what are the messages and how the messages move people. Just some general trends on who consumes what, and these are super generalized. Daily newspaper readers are older and have higher income education. TV news watchers are more politically polarized. Online social media consumers are younger and less engaged, except when they aren't. There are a bunch of hyper engaged people on social media, but like that 90% of people who are consuming their media online actually aren't that engaged. And then everyone listens to the radio. It's something like over 90% of the population listens to the radio, but each station has wildly different demographics. And so you really do want to be doing your research on this. If you're an arts organization, always be doing audience surveys or donor surveys. If you want to do client surveys, where do they get their news? How do they get their news? What are, the issues that they care about, that type of thing. So you have an idea of who it is that's engaging with your organization and how they actually got there. I will say that in my job now, and when I've been a communications director, I'll spend about 5 times as much doing research as I will do actually doing any sort of writing or distribution. Having that profile really clearly kind of in your head as who you want to reach, it does take a lot of work, and it is worth it to be able to do that work. Research is the takeaway. Again, our friend Ron, I won't belabor this too much, but you always hear about, well, we need to build relationships with the press. And it's true. So here are a couple of ideas. One is reporters don't have to be your friend. But if you want to have a good professional relationship with anyone, it's built on communication. So you need to be talking to these people on a regular basis and not just pitching all the time. Right. So, the most basic thing is you want to follow up. If you send a pitch, follow up. Hey, get them on the phone, send them a follow-up email. Hey, how's it going? Did you get the story? Is this something you guys are looking for? What do you think? Can I connect you with the source? That's the very minimum. And you should have your 20 or 30 reporters on your hot list that you always want to be calling. But this is sort of a pre-COVID tip, but you can hang out where reporters hang out. At most state capitals and a lot of city halls, there's a press room or a series of press offices. Often there's a press conference room. And it's fine just to walk through, say, hey, here's who I am. It's good to meet you. I just wanted to let you know I'm going to be sending you some content soon, about XYZ. So, I want to make sure I've got your phone and email right. Would you mind giving it to me? Or can I get your card? Here's my card. Obviously a little harder to do in COVID times. So you kind of have to do the best you can, if there's sort of virtual hearings, that type of thing, or one thing that we do in Minnesota, and I don't know if you do this in Montana, is there are the governor's office does COVID briefings, and reporters have the opportunity to ask questions, and public radio broadcasts it. And so you can listen in and you can hear who the reporters are and what they're asking. And that hopefully will give you an idea of what it is they're interested in and what you might want to think about sending them. Don't be afraid to have background conversations as well. Whether you're in the Capitol or you called them to follow up. Journalists can be cynical and can be a little wary on the onset, but really they're trying to figure you out. They want to figure out what your angle is and why you're talking to them. And it's okay to be open about that. It's okay to get off of your talking points and say, well, on background, we're doing X, Y, and Z. And it's not that you're being dishonest. It's just you want to be able to have a candid conversation with a journalist from time to time, so that they have a real understanding of why it is you're doing what you're doing. Just like, the purpose of this webinar is to try to help you put yourself in journalist shoes. Having that background conversation helps a journalist put themselves in your shoes. One of the best ways to do that is to buy them coffee. Journalists run on coffee like anyone else. You probably, if you're in a state capitol, you probably know the place where all the nonprofit people hang out. So take the journalists there and introduce them to people. And then the last thing really comes back to doing your research. Local media is extremely transient as an industry. Often the person you talked to last month is not going to be the person you're talking to the next month. So you want to be constantly updating your lists. I would say do it at least a month. Every month is to, be taking that hot list of 20 and 30 people and just checking to make sure they're all still there. All right, so to get into a little bit of radio, I won't go through these links, but if you want to see what the demographics are on radio, I'd encourage you to check them out after the webinar when I send out the slides. But just to say, according to Nielsen, something like 94% of people still listen to the radio, and it's something like 90% of people ages 18 to 34. So even the younger people are listening to the radio. That number is higher if you're trying to reach non-white populations, people of color, indigenous people. The numbers are something like 99% for Hispanics and 98% for Black identifying people. So if you've decided you want to, do a major push in radio, one of the best ways to start figuring out who the players are in that space is to look up your media market. If you click on this link, it'll take you to an interactive version of this map. So you can go find the place where you are, you hover over it, it tells you what the media market is, gives you a little bit of statistics. And what you can see here is that Montana doesn't, the media markets for Montana are clearly not state borders. What we're talking about here is broadcast ranges primarily. So, if you're trying to reach someone in the far western part of the state, you might be looking at doing some pitching in Idaho Falls, for example, or gosh, there's not much in western North and South Dakota, so I don't know who you'd reach out to there for the eastern part of the state. So the next thing you want to do is, what I always do when I'm looking up a new media market is I just Google Nielsen ratings in Billings, Montana. Nielsen radio ratings, Billings, Montana, and it'll take you to this site below, the ratings.radioonline.com, and you can look up it'll take you right to the media market, but you can also just go to that site and type in the media market you want to look up. And it will give you the top, it'll give you the top stations in that market. And just a quick primer on how to read these. So it gives you the population up here, and then, and this is true for television as well, by the way. It gives you the population up here, and then these numbers are a percentage. So KCTR in fall of 2018 reached 12.3% of the population in this market. So it looks, what would that be? About 15,000 people. So just real quick back here, the other thing you can see here is that it tells you the owners of these markets. And one thing that is unique to radio is that often there will be a central news director who's doing the news for a bunch of different stations called a cluster, because the clusters are all owned by the same media group. So you have a a media group that owns, well, as you can see here, Town Square owns the top 4 stations in the market. Desert Mountain owns the rest. So this is, if you go to Desert Mountain's site, you can see again the stations that they are running in the Billings market. Normally, one thing you can do is go to the site and you can look up the contact information for the news director there. So I would encourage you to do that for the big stations and whatever markets you are trying to reach. But I also happen to know that Montana is a little bit unique in that most of the bigger stations and clusters are getting their most of the bigger stations and clusters are getting their news from Northern News Service. So let me just get to there. So the Northern News Network, which is part of the Northern Broadcasting System. And so you can see here, Denise Smith is the news director, and Northern News Network is distributing to maybe 50 stations around the state. So, look up the contact, add them to your database. Some tips for working with radio producers, and this is a little bit true for TV as well, broadcast in general. One is just whatever medium you're pitching in, you want to know what that medium sounds like or looks like, right? Often with print and online, it's really easy because you just look up the article and it's there on demand. With broadcast, it's a little different. You have to tune in at the top of the hour or the bottom of the hour to get that newscast. Right, public radio is often is a different animal, and commercial news radio to an extent as well. Although even commercial news radio is a lot more sort of talk and opinion than it is news anymore, unfortunately. But listen to the top of the hour newscast. One thing that I spend time doing a few times a year is I will listen to that top of the hour newscast and I'll just count every time they do a new story: 1,000, 2, 1,000, 3, 1,000. So I know how long each clip is within that newscast. Often they are 30 seconds or less. They used to be longer. They've gotten, we used to do all of our stories as a 2-minute full radio story with a 50-second first cut. Now we do it as a 2-minute full story with a 30-second first cut. Because we know that for a lot of stations, they're trying to get the the length of the stories in their newscasts down, and really the reason for that is so they can spend more time advertising. Again, local media is in a hard spot. So again, just to reiterate, often the news director is doing the top and the bottom of the hour newscast for a cluster of different stations that are in different formats. So that same newscast may go out on a Christian broadcaster. It may go out on a country station, a talk radio station, a sports radio station. If you hear, and again, a lot of these are pulling from syndicated or national sources as well. So the CBS the CBS News airing on whatever the local station is. But then often they will also have a local news break or a local newscast as well. Or it'll be 3 minutes of CBS News and then 2 minutes of local news. So being able to understand those formats and just how the industry works, I think really helps you do your outreach. It makes it so you're doing it smarter. You're not, emailing 6 different stations and it's all going to the same email address. But what it means practically is that, especially for commercial media, polarity management and being able to introduce multiple perspectives in your pitch or your storytelling is important because the different stations all have different audiences that are going to be pretty ideologically diverse, or at least diverse in their demographics. Right, the oldies station is going to have a different listenership than the top 40 station. Is going to have a different listenership than sports radio. And so, again, you're not sacrificing the mission of your organization in the way that you're telling the story, but you are telling it in a way so that you have some of that appeal to a broad audience, and acknowledging multiple perspectives really puts your best foot forward in doing that. Broadcast news has its own formatting, and so let me just pull this up. Oh, I forgot to make my PowerPoint bigger. This is what a broadcast script looks like for a radio story. It's similar for television. What you can see here is that it's done in cuts, right? So we've got the first cut is here. There's an intro, there's a quote, there's a tag. Here's the second cut, reporter talking and another quote. And then there's a third cut, reporter talking, another quote, and then there's an ending tag here. What you want to think about when you're doing your pitch or writing your press release is, can what I'm writing be broken up into that type of those types of segments, so that it is easy to use and easy for someone to get my press release, maybe change a couple words, print it out, put it up in front of the microphone and read it like it's a news story. If you do that, it makes the producer or journalist job much, much easier. If you're pitching broadcast, make sure that your spokespeople are prepped to be on live sound. Make sure they've got access to a phone or an internet connection that will produce high quality audio, and make sure that they're standing by so that when the reporter calls, they answer the phone. I can't tell you how many times we've had a really good story ready to go and we just haven't been able to get hold of that last source, and we've had to either sit on the story for a couple of days or we just didn't publish it. So answering the phone is critical for broadcast. It's especially true if you have sources from more than one organization. You really want to be coordinating with your fellow communications people, or if you're coordinating the whole thing with the sources from other organizations, it's really worth your time to do the legwork to make sure they are absolutely there and ready to answer the phone. Again, sounds obvious, but it's the little things that make or break your pitch. And then the last thing is, if you're really on top of it, you can record the sound of the quotes that are going out with your pitch and send it. Often those files are, fairly small, so you can send all of the quotes in one email. If you break them up into individual sound files, and it's, generally will be less than a megabyte. Pardon me for a sec. Something in my throat. But again, that makes it really easy for the producer to read your script, pop in the quote file, keep reading, pop in the quote file. It makes it easy to do what's called plug and play. All right, so that's sort of the meat of what I had to say. To recap, though, we're not writing press releases, right? We're telling stories, and stories need to have certain elements in order to make them compelling content, right? Part of that is making sure that there is diversity within our story, so tension and release, multiple perspectives, but really tying it all back to the mission of what you're trying to get accomplished. Right, so you need to know the goal. You need to know the goal. Do I need 50 people to call their senator? Do I need 100 people to buy tickets to my event? Do I need, do I need to reach people who are on food stamps or people who are housing insecure to let them know that this shelter is going to be open these hours? Right? Try to get as specific as you can in thinking about what it is your goal is. Know who needs to hear it, right? And then go do your research to figure out the best mediums that you're going to reach people in. Really make sure you understand the industry. Again, we looked at broadcast. Print is its own animal. Online is its own animal. They may seem pretty straightforward on the front end, the end that we're viewing, but they've all got very unique back ends and supply chains from getting the story from when it comes into their inbox to actually being put on the air, put on the website, or put in the, mailing the newspaper out. Sending the newspaper out. So the idea is if we know the industry, we can make it as easy as possible for the journalists or reporters in that industry to use what we're sending them. And of course, the other thing that I forgot to put on here is that, sometimes the best way to do research is just to call them and ask. In addition to building the relationships, it gives you a lot of knowledge about what's going on in the industry. And then, as far as evaluation on your media outreach efforts, there are a couple things that I want to say. One is that you shouldn't use the sheer volume of people that you've reached as an indicator of success in achieving your goal, right? You should really use the goal, because sometimes you do want to reach a more narrow audience of people who are going to engage more deeply. So if if you're in Montana and you have a shelter in Bozeman, a story in the New York Times is, great for exposure for your organization, but it's not going to help you achieve the goal of reaching housing insecure people in Bozeman, Montana. Right? There is a much, less prestigious outlet that will probably help you achieve your goals better. The other thing, well, two more things. One, in terms of online media, just to touch briefly on it, is that often people will, and this gets to reach and not goals, but often people will focus on online media because it is easy to get the metrics on it. And the metaphor I like to use on that is you hear the joke about someone who's looking for, they lost $1. Someone comes up and says, "Where'd you lose your dollar?" "Well, over there." "Well, if you lost it over there, how come you're looking here?" "Well, because this is where the lamp is." And I think that that's true of online media to an extent. Just because you're able to access the metrics doesn't necessarily mean that those metrics are important to, one, achieving your goals, but two, as popular or as well seen as a medium in which maybe you don't have as good of metrics that are accessible to you. And then the third thing is, never take a single data point as indicative of future success. So if you send something out to a bunch of radio stations and you don't get any play on the radio, don't take that as a sign that you shouldn't pitch radio anymore. I would say that for any medium that you're trying to break into, or any specific media outlet, you need to give it at least a year of pretty consistent contact and consistent outreach in order to really get the attention of the people there and to have a sense of whether or not that media is a fit for what you're trying to do. I would say 90% of emails that don't get responded to is not because they don't care about what you're doing. It's because they're either too busy or they have 100 different other pitches. But if they see your name, 8, 9, 10, 20, 50 times in their inbox, well, okay, that's someone I need to pay attention to now. I'm going to read their stuff. And then maybe by the 70th time, they'll either let you know, well, okay, I'll take it, or I won't. Sometimes you'll get lucky on the first shot, but it really is the grunt work and the regularity of contact that's what's going to allow you to break in to different medium. So research and persistence, those are the two very high level buzzwords that I will I'll leave you with. That is the end of my prepared presentation. I am happy to field any questions if anyone has any. But again, I want to thank MNA for letting us do the webinar. If you're interested in learning more about Public News Service, this is all my contact information. I'm happy to talk with you about how our model works. All right, Shelby, do we have questions?
None coming in yet. I'll keep an eye, but just want to say thank you. You covered a ton so efficiently in a short amount of time. So thank you so much. And I know we'll have some folks looking forward to seeing those slides so they can review some of the great points you made, as well as the recording. Thank you for that. And thank you all for being here. I have a question as we're waiting for others. Do you have any stories that come to mind, or examples of nonprofits that have done this well, or maybe learned to do it well over the years that come to the front of your mind?
Yeah, there are a few. Some of them are national, and I would say there are a lot of nonprofits who are really doing this well. One that comes to mind for me is the National Wildlife Federation. They're spending, they're very active in Montana, but they're spending a lot of time talking about the value of public lands. And I think they do a good job of acknowledging all of the affected communities in their storytelling and encompassing that into how they talk about their work and how their work is valuable to different groups, even though those groups may be coming at it from different angles or having different opinions. So that's one angle I would say, or that's one organization I would say right off the bat is doing it quite well. Let's see, what's another example? Okay, well, I'll give you an example of, one that I had, and this is a specific story where the issue that we were talking about is my background in the nonprofit sector is actually international trade policy and specifically as it relates to agriculture. But we had done, the organization I was at had done a report on the use of nanotechnology in fertilizer. And that's a pretty heady topic. It's not, I mean, it's just, and if you read the report, your head would be spinning. But what we were able to do was kind of boil it down to its essence, which is that this is an unregulated substance that is seeping into the water supply. And, not making a value judgment whether or not this is a good or bad thing, but the fact that it was going completely unregulated and untalked about was a problem. And was affecting water quality, and that effect on water quality was completely unknown. I have a 6-month-old puppy who's whining very loudly at my feet, so I apologize if you hear the extra noise. But so what we did is we really led with the water quality issue, and then we were able to quote some farmers who were saying, my crops butt up against the stream, and we care a lot about protecting the water in this community, and so the idea that these products are going to be on the market soon is worrisome. And so, I think that was a story where I really didn't think at the offset we were going to be able to tell something there. But as we, went through some of these practices, we were able to turn it into something that actually got quite decent pickup and play a couple of years ago. So those are two examples just off the top of my head.
Thanks for that, Josh. I appreciate those. This is coming in from Hannah. Do you have any specific recommendations for educational nonprofits?
Well, I have learned that unless I'm working in education policy, or it depends on what kind of education you do, but I know that there is no panacea for what works for education, both in terms of like, well, I guess that's my opinion. I shouldn't say that. I should say that there are a lot of really diverse perspectives on what works for education, and people feel very, very strongly about them. But again, I would say it depends on what you're trying to do, right? If it's something where you want to, highlight the work that you're doing in the classroom, I would definitely say that, being able to put students front and center is always an effective pitch, and being able to tell their stories, especially if you've got the data to back it up, right? If you can get a kid on the radio or on TV as your quoted source, that's great. I mean, so that's just a really low level one that works for everybody. But, again, I think, when you're talking about education, the issues get really complex really quickly. And there are a ton of perspectives. And so, a ton of perspectives who feel very strongly about what they do. So, I would say any journalist who is worth their salt, if they get a pitch from you, they're going to look and see, okay, so what is the other side saying about this? And so if you can acknowledge that within the story, I guess the best way to say it is that if you don't frame those different perspectives in your pitch, it's going to be framed for you in somebody else's story when they take it. So the more you can get out in front of that and acknowledge the multiple perspectives, I think this is especially true in education, but it applies across the board. The more likely it is that your framing is going to be the one that's used when when the story is actually published. I hope that's helpful. I'm not sure if I actually got at what you were talking about, but
yeah, that's a great answer, Josh. And she mentioned she was working with an after-school language and culture nonprofit, and said thanks.
Oh, okay. Yeah, put the kids out there. Get them, get those kids in front of as many people as possible.
And one more from Denise, and of course, if you have other questions come in, please feel free to chat them in. What do you find most effective in reaching reporters you don't already know who might be not in the same community you're in? Is it best to reach out by phone, email, carrier?
all three, or not all, phone and email. If you can go to them in person, go to them in person. But of course, it's a pre-COVID suggestion. I will say, I think this is true beyond media. This is true for communications in general. And if you're doing any fundraising, this is definitely true, is that you need to reach out to people through multiple different channels. People, it's not just that some people are more likely to pick up the phone or some people are more likely to respond to email. It's that people actually take in information in different ways. You've probably heard about this: verbal learners, visual learners, tactile learners. So, I'm not saying if they're a tactile learner, you should go up and hug them while you tell them about your pitch, but there are ways, right? So, the more different ways you can be reaching out to them, the better. For me, whenever I'm doing outreach work, I'll send an initial email and then I'll call and say, hey, did you get my email? I just wanted to follow up to the email I sent. Or if I leave if I decide I want to call them first, I'll send an email a couple, days later or a couple hours later, depending on how urgent it is, and say, hey, I just wanted to follow up to my voicemail. And then again, as I talked about, especially if it's someone new or in a new market, you really do need to spend some time making regular contact with them, just by way of introduction. And just be really explicit about it. Hi, I'm with such and such nonprofit. We're looking, we will be doing more work in your community, or your community represents a certain constituency to us. We'd really like to start, sending you material, and we'd like for you to get to know our organization a little bit better. Can we set up a background call? It doesn't hurt to be really explicit about what your intentions are, because that's what's helpful in disarming a lot of the cynicism that is there right up front.
Thank you, Josh. That is so helpful. And also, I think we might have to see this puppy, but appreciate it.
Oh, he's 50 pounds, so I can't pick him up.
Good point. Good point. Well, thank you so much for a really, really rich and helpful conversation. I think, especially as we all look at the start of the legislative session, potentially coming up here in Montana in the next couple of months. I think these are all great reminders and great things to return to as folks begin to get ready for winter and the session and the stories they need to tell. And thank you so much. Thanks to everyone for attending, and please feel free to reach out to us or to Josh if you have further questions.
Thank you, everyone.